Thanks for joining us today. In light of some of the recent events in Brattleboro, I thought it would be a good idea to go through some of the basics on fire prevention with two of the people most in the know in the Brattleboro community. To my right, Brattleboro Fire Chief Mike Bukasi, and to my left, Brattleboro Assistant Fire Chief Pete Lynch. Thank you guys, and you have one of those jobs where you never know when or where you're going to be working, but you pull it off well. So thank you on behalf of the community.
Thank you.
Now, a lot has been said since the mid-April fire at the Brooks House in Brattleboro, and one of the things that was mentioned but really was not discussed in any great detail is something that happens a lot in fires. When the alarm went off, people didn't automatically evacuate. Take us through what happens when a fire alarm goes off in any kind of a building and what that means both in terms of the status of a fire and the time that residents or people inside a building would have to exit.
Sure, Tim. A building fire alarm is required by code in many instances, depending on the occupancy, the size of the building, things like that. The purpose of a building fire alarm is to give residents and occupants early notification that there could possibly be a problem in the building, a smoke condition, a fire, or possibly some other emergency that a lot of times an occupant will pull a fire alarm just to get some help for another emergency. In the Brooks House incident back in mid-April, after a lot of interviews, running some timelines, looking into the situation, we found that there was a delay of anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes before anybody was notified of the fire. We had a report of patrons of businesses in the downtown area that had been in the Harmony lot actually watching the fire that was venting out of the back of the building, but yet not calling 911. So obviously this fire had a tremendous head start on the fire crews, which allowed it to progress a long ways. The other thing through the interviews were that we found out that occupants, when the fire alarm was finally activated, they didn't evacuate the building. We had search crews on all of the floors, obviously in the very early stages of the fire, going from room to room on all of the 4 floors, the upper floors, banging on doors. And when we couldn't get into an apartment, we forced that door open to check for occupants. Numerous times we found occupants, estimated 10 to 15 minutes into this incident, that were sitting in their living room watching TV. They were in bed sleeping or doing other things in the apartment, just totally ignoring the fire alarm and the shouts of the firefighters to evacuate the building. So we just want to take this opportunity to, pass on the message that the fire alarm is there for a reason, and even though sometimes there are false alarms, that please pay attention to the fire alarm and to evacuate the building when it does go off.
So what are the circumstances that would trigger a fire alarm? Most times it's being triggered by an actual fire, is it not?
It is.
It certainly is. Smoke travel causes the alarm to go off. Heat sometimes causes the alarm to go off, and the minute the alarm goes off, it's indicating that there's some sort of a problem in the building.
So that should be your cue to what? Immediately evacuate?
Get out and stay out. It's as simple as that. You're doing yourself a great favor and doing other tenants in the building and firefighters a great favor by leaving the building, moving away from the building, and allowing us to do our jobs.
I think an important message that Pete was relaying there also is to stay out. We had several occupants that tried to re-enter the building to retrieve valuables, to retrieve some property, and they're only putting themselves in danger, as well as the firefighters that again need to go back in and get them out.
You know, belongings are just that. They're stuff. They're not people. And in fire situations, in emergency situations, we all get a little concerned when we might act the way we wouldn't act normally. We think about things that might not be important, and that might happen. But you're saying it's a difference sometimes between life or death for either them or somebody else?
They're seriously putting themselves in jeopardy by trying to re-enter, a burning building. And like you say, even though we understand it's personal belongings and it's whether it be sentimental value or otherwise, nothing is worth a human life. And obviously, our task through our job is to save that human life, and for people to try to go back in just puts themselves in danger needlessly.
It's interesting, Tim, to know that fire doubles in size every 30 seconds, and so a fire can travel quite quickly. In the case of the Brooks house, it traveled through a lot of void spaces and popped out unexpectedly in a number of different spots. And when we put ourselves in the position where we needed to evacuate ourselves from the building that night, the conditions in the building changed from day to night in a matter of 1 or 2 minutes. And so if it takes 5 minutes for an occupant to travel from the end of a building to get out to the street of the building, away from the building, in that 5-minute period, conditions can change drastically. And even if you don't see smoke initially, you don't smell smoke initially, it certainly doesn't mean that there isn't an issue in the building. And the quicker you can get out, the safer you'll be.
You know, both of you have thousands of hours of training as firefighters. Pete, you've been on the Brattleboro Department 25 years. Mike, you've been serving this community for 35 years. You've probably seen a lot, but a lot of people just don't understand what a fire can do. How quickly can these situations change when you're dealing with combustible material, intense heat, and heavy smoke?
Sure, like Assistant Chief Lynch said, conditions can change, as quick as you can turn around. A smoke condition can change to the point where it may be, drifting along its ceiling height, and all of a sudden it's banking down to the point where you need to be down on your hands and knees to get underneath the smoke layer. If heat builds up fast enough, a room can, what we call, flash over. Everything ignites at once. And those conditions are pretty much unsurvivable if that was to happen. So things can change very quickly, very dramatically.
And the other thing I was struck by was that several people were watching this particular incident and nobody called 911. When do you call 911 in an emergency situation?
Immediately. When you think there's a problem, that's the time to be calling. That being said, it's pretty easy to overwhelm the dispatch or the state of Vermont with your telephone calls. But if there's a question as to whether or not the emergency has been reported, everybody carries a cell phone these days, and you should pick it up, dial 911, and let them know what's going on.
So you shouldn't worry that someone else might have already placed the call.
If there's any question at all, Tim, we urge people, call 911. It's that important.
Any kind of a emergency situation, especially in your particular expertise dealing with fire?
We would rather get 25 calls on something that people perceive as an emergency than not to be notified. In this case with the Brooks house, it certainly could have meant, the difference between saving a life and not saving a life. And by the grace of God, there were no injuries or loss of life that night. But just the delay certainly could change conditions in a hurry.
Now, that particular night, there were a lot of circumstances that were were fast changing, and as I remember, at various times, you pulled firefighters out of the building because it had gotten even unsafe for someone wearing all the protective gear?
At one point, approximately an hour and a half into the fire, we still had search and rescue crews on all of the floors, going room to room, in what we call a secondary search. And basically, they were going back and retracing all of their steps and checking all of the rooms over again to make sure everybody was out. That fire being such, the building being such the layout that it was, if you were out on the Main Street side, you saw some smoke now and then, and also a little bit of fire now and then would break out in the 5th floor area, the penthouse as we called it. Out back in the Harmony lot that Assistant Chief had command of out there, he had a ton of fire. It was just a whole different world because all of the fire was in the back of that building. And then at one point, that 5th floor, again the penthouse area, really lit up with a lot of fire, and at that point we made the decision that the building was no longer safe for our firefighters to be in there, and we did do what we call a back out, and we backed everybody out of the building.
What kind of temperatures are happening when a fire of this magnitude happens, and what is combustible? I mean, a lot of us think, well, we might not have something that would burn that quickly, but at those temperatures maybe it does.
I'm certain that night the temperatures were somewhere between 800 and 1200 degrees at the ceiling of each room, and as temperatures raise to that level, it heats up everything in a particular room, and there are very few things that will not burn, and there will very few things that will not give off gases that are very extraordinarily harmful to people.
Yeah, that's the other point. A lot of times when things are burning, there are gases which, if you inhale, they could cause you a world of hurt in a hurry.
That's very true, Tim. Another reason to get out quickly. If you were to open the kitchen counter and look at all of the cleaners and solvents and plastics that are in your cabinets, when those are on fire, they give off terribly harmful vapors, and they can do extraordinary damage to your respiratory system.
So some of these rules you talked about, in the case of a larger building, they really do apply even down to a single-family home, do they not?
Certainly they do. Even more so maybe in a single-family home. An apartment tends not to be furnished, quite as heavily, I guess would be the word, as a single-family home might be. The stuffed furniture, your couches, your chairs, and as Assistant Chief Lynch mentioned, the plastics, they all give off when they're burning cyanide gas, which is, we all know, is deadly. So you just don't escape the gases. They're everywhere in a fire.
One of the things that I was always taught is, if there's more than one of you in a house, or in this case in an apartment, how important is it to have something like a prearranged meeting place when you leave a building, and then make sure everybody's accounted for?
Sure. Very important. We go into the schools and we stress to the children, go home, talk to your parents, have a meeting place, whether it be the big tree out in your front yard, whether it be a neighbor's house. So if you get separated while you're getting out, to go to this meeting place, so when the firefighters or the emergency workers get there, everybody knows you're out. You're all together, and we have a head count, and we can account for everybody. With that said, one of the things that we found, again in the Brooks House fire, was this was a very long building. We called it wings. We had the Main Street wing, and then we had the High Street section that ran up High Street with a center stairwell. One of the things that was discovered, people all the way on one end of a hallway that were 2 or 3 apartments away from an outside fire escape were walking back or escaping down that center stairwell, going through a smoke condition in the hallways. Because that was the way they always used to go in and out. That was the way that they're used to. Human nature just takes over. Again, know your ways out, know your escape routes. In an emergency, those people would have been much safer just to go down in the outside fire escapes. That's what they're there for. So it's just good to think ahead of time, the right ways out in an emergency, the easiest and safest ways out.
Interestingly enough, a lot of credit should be given to one of the first men that left the building. He had the wherewithal to reach up and pull the fire alarm to notify all the other tenants of the building that there was an emergency. At the time that he realized that there was a problem in the building, the fire alarm system had not yet been activated, and that's because the fire was traveling in voids. And on the way out of the building, he pulled the alarm, and it notified the rest of the tenants. And that, good job in his case. Great. It was great that he did that. The quicker we can notify people, the better off they are.
In voids, what, places that would not necessarily get picked up by a smoke detector?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Gentlemen, while we have you here, it's summertime. A lot of us like to barbecue. A lot of us like to maybe burn some brush in the backyard. Firstly, for burning brush, what are some of the things that people need to do it safely and do it legally?
In terms of brush, you'll need a permit in the town of Brattleboro, and you can go online actually to get a permit. And if you go to the Brattleboro Fire Department website, you can click on the icon that says burn permit, and it will lead you through directions to get a burn permit. We only allow burning when the weather is conducive to not having brush fires. When the ground is wet, when the ground is green, are the times that we feel like it's safe for people to burn. And when you are burning, there are a few key rules. Keep it small, stay with it, and have the proper tools in case there is an emergency. A rake, a garden hose, and a cell phone.
A cell phone to call the fire department if it's something you can't handle yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you're thinking there's a problem, again, that's the time to be calling. Don't let it overwhelm you and then call. Call before it gets to the point where it's going to be well out of control.
And those things can very quickly get out of control, especially on a windy day.
A little breeze, a little breeze.
And as well, barbecuing, whether it's charcoal, whether it's, in my case, I've got a bricked up area that I burn a little wood to cook the hamburgers on. Those same rules apply. You don't need a permit for a barbecue, obviously, but still.
No permit required for a cooking fire. However, a hot, sunny, windy day in the summer, and you're at the bottom of a bank where the fire can travel up, you're setting yourself up for a lot of problems. So yeah, it's great to be cognizant of these things and think about where you're going to have your fire before you do that.
Now, the other end of it is when your barbecue's all done, you get set to put it out. What do you recommend? Staying with it until it burns itself out 12 hours later, or what do you think?
Well, no question, you want to make sure it's out before you're done. A couple pails of water and stirring it up with a metal rake would go a long way. And in terms of apartment buildings, commercial buildings in the town of Brattleboro, you have to be a minimum distance of 10 feet away from the building to do any sort of burning or cooking.
I think one of the things with the barbecues too is we see some things, and maybe it's just because we're in the business, but we shake our heads and wonder why people do it.
Human nature.
Human nature, absolutely. Charcoal grills are making a comeback again. and those charcoal briquettes stay hot for a long time. Don't dump your grill into a paper bag or a cardboard box and set it on your deck, because you're only asking for problems there. You know, leave the grill away a good distance away from any combustibles, and truly let it cool for a day, 2 days, and then dump it into a metal container to dispose of it. You know, same rules apply to a wood stove. When you clean out a wood stove or a pellet stove, you think it's out, or you think they're cool, but with a little bit of air they get good and cherry red again, and it could cause you problems.
You know, I've had situations even in my own wood barbecue pit where as much as 24 hours after the fire was out, you dig around, stir around the coals, you'll still find hot coals.
You will, and it doesn't take much to get them to flare up again. If you give them a little bit of air, you turn them over, if a good breeze comes along, they get hot again.
That's a good point. In the middle of the summer, when it's the driest out, we might get a little rain in the morning, and people would say, "Oh, I'm good to go for the afternoon for burning brush." But the hot sun and a little breeze at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon can lend towards very, very dry conditions and potential for a lot of fire spread.
So in a burning permit situation, there might be days where you do issue permits in the morning, but you might not in the afternoon, depending on the conditions.
It's very true. There's mornings that we may issue permits, and you know, by noon, 1 o'clock, conditions have changed. The wind has come up. We get weather forecasts and forest fire warnings from the state every day during the summer, and we may end up calling or visiting, you know, anywhere from 5 to 15 burn permit locations and having them put them out just because the conditions have changed that much.
So gentlemen, we've only touched the surface on the issue of fire prevention and safety in the event of a fire. But both of you have a wealth of knowledge about this particular subject, and it's what you do. In case people have questions, should they just give you a call at the fire station?
Absolutely. They can call Assistant Chief Lynch, myself, any of the firefighters that are on duty. You know, we have a great staff, and very dedicated staff. And any questions that we can help with, you know, feel free to call the business number at the fire station, and if we don't have the answer, we'll get it and we'll get back to them.
And you guys are there 24/7. And granted, I won't call you at 3 o'clock in the morning unless it's an emergency, but still, good to know you're there.
Absolutely.
Well, again, on behalf of a very, and I mean very grateful community, thank you to the efforts of both of you gentlemen, your department, and all the other departments involved with the mutual aid, because frankly, your efforts saved a single building fire from being a major catastrophe along the lines of what happened prior to that building being rebuilt in 1871.
Yeah. We're glad that it turned out the way it did.
So are we. Good to have you guys on our team.
Thank you.
Brattleboro Fire Chief Mike Bukasi, Brattleboro Deputy Fire Chief Pete Lynch. Just remember, fire is not a game. It's not something to play around with. It's deadly. It can kill. Don't let it be anyone you love or anybody you know. Take heed to what these guys say. This is Tim Johnson. Thanks for watching.